Hello, and welcome to Zócalo Public Square. I'm Lisa Margonelli. I'm a senior editor at Issues in Science and Technology. We're a quarterly journal, and we're published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and also Arizona State University. We're proud to partner with Zócalo today to present today's conversation, How Will Robot Trucks Change American Life? Joining me to explore that question is Dr. Steve Viscelli, who recently wrote an article on automated trucking that was published in Issues. Steve is a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania, and he studies freight transportation. His first book was called The Big Rig, Trucking and the Decline of the American Dream. And it explains how long-haul trucking went from being one of the best blue-collar jobs to one of the worst. More recently, he's been studying automated trucking. Steve, I'm delighted to be speaking with you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
It's great. So the first question I wanted to ask you was, you were actually a trucker. So tell me what it was like to be a trucker briefly, and there's many different kinds of trucks. There's short haul trucks, there's long haul trucks, there's big trucks, little trucks, package delivery trucks, gas trucks, lots of kinds of trucks. What kind of trucks did you drive, and what was it like?
So, it was a big, shift from, I started out as a sociology graduate student. I was interested in labor and, heard about satellite linked computers that were tracking truck drivers. And I just read all this management literature on, how you get workers to work hard. And I thought, this is probably affecting how people are seeing the job. And the way that most people get into the trucking industry is how I got into it. So, I wanted to do this dissertation on trucking. I decided I couldn't just, watch trucks from the side of the highway or try to interview drivers, without having a sense of what the job was like. So at that point, we still had, a local paper in circulation. I picked it up, found an ad for a company that was hiring in my area and, submitted an application. Next thing you know, they're busing you 3 or 4 states away to a CDL school, they call them, where you spend a couple of weeks learning to shift the thing.
How many gears did it have?
So the truck I learned on had 10 gears, which is pretty standard for the big companies that dominate the kind of training of new and employment of new truck drivers. Almost everybody enters the industry through the long haul segment in what's called truckload, meaning you go kind of point to point with a full trailer full of stuff. It's usually either a dry van, which just is a standard box truck. You can put just about anything in that.
Like a UPS truck, your basic truck.
Yeah. And then, a refrigeration, a reefer is basically that dry van with a refrigeration unit. Those are the 2 most common. And that's where most rookies start out.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first couple of weeks you're learning to shift and do some basic turns, and then they let you menace the public after a couple of weeks. And then you spend a few more months, usually anywhere from a month and a half to 2 months, out with a more experienced driver, living out of the truck together and sort of really learning how the job is done. And then if you do well, then you're ready to go out solo.
So that's a long haul truck that you're out for with the experienced driver and living in the truck.
Yeah, so this would be, what's a Class A commercial driver's license for an articulated vehicle that's over 29,000 pounds. So the sort of typical big rig you'd see out on the highway.
All right. So once you were driving, what was it like?
It's intense. There's definitely a few weeks, months on your own of sort of getting up to speed and becoming an efficient driver. You have to get over the terror of, operating this giant vehicle with crazy 4-wheelers, as they call them, kind of zooming all around. And the lifestyle itself is all encompassing. So you're out on the road for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, at least. You're working sometimes in excess of 100 hours a week. Just your entire day, 24 hours a day is timed to the loads that you're hauling.
And it's
exhausting. So I would start out, one of the things I told myself when I started was, I'm not going to let this destroy my health. And the health consequences of truck driving are just enormous. You're breathing diesel fuel fumes 24 hours a day. You're eating truck stop food. You can't exercise. So I would start out with a whole bunch of, frozen meals and fresh food. I happened to park my truck at the factory that like all my ancestors had worked at in Rome, New York, and my grandmother's house was right like in the shadow of the factory. And she was this great cook, and she would prepare all these frozen meals and like send
Uh-huh.
me off on my tour of duty, with fresh food. And that would last, 6, 7 days. I had a little refrigerator and a little stove lunchbox that could heat things up. Um, and then you'd be stuck with truck stop food. So what I would do is try to hit I'd skip a few meals and then try to hit one of the big buffets that actually had like a salad bar and things that resembled actual food. Like if I could identify it, that was a good starting point. Like that's a piece of chicken, that's a piece
Mhm.
of broccoli. A lot of times you can't. You need to actually read the labels to try to figure out what the thing is supposed to be
All
approximately.
right. So what I want to move on, this whole conversation is going to be about automated trucking or robot trucking or driverless trucking, all same words, different words for the same thing. But what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is, we're talking about sort of doing away, well, we might be talking about with kind of doing away with this kind of trucking job. What are we potentially going to get out of this? Like, what is the rosiest scenario for society from automated trucking? Let's start with the good stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, the good stuff comes from some of the bad stuff that happens in the existing industry, right? And solving some of these problems. First of all, we have, a lot of highway deaths that are involving trucks. And those,
And,
unfortunately, are on the rise.
mhm. And I believe 2019, we had 5,000 highway deaths because of big rigs and 139,000 injuries or something like that. I mean, I was kind of floored by
Yeah.
those.
And unfortunately, those highway deaths, as we, after the Great Recession, were about 1,000 less annually than they are today. So we're, despite all of the, new technology, blind spot alerts and forward collision avoidance and things that are starting to be adopted, we're seeing, less safe highways. A lot of that has to do with distracted driving, certainly.
So automated trucking could make the roads safer?
Yeah, I mean, so right now, just with the potential of sort of immediate technologies of forward collision avoidance and technologies that will, prevent the truck from departing its lane, we can eliminate a lot of most of those really nasty fatal accidents. What happens in those accidents almost all the time is, in the highway situation is, a car is rear-ended by a truck. Now that's oftentimes not the truck's immediate fault. Cars often get in front, slam on their brakes or something like that. But a lot of times it's because the trucker does not, stop in time. And, the truck departs the lane. Sometimes it's because the driver's distracted or not paying attention, or some other reason that that can be prevented. So, that's probably the biggest top line benefit that especially developers are focused on. But when you look at the trucking industry and how, especially these long haul jobs work, they're terribly inefficient. And if you could imagine having your biggest capital investment in that truck, and rather than having it actually moving and producing sort of the service of trucking, someone's using it as a rolling motel, more than
Mhm.
half of the day usually. So if you look at these big trucks at these big firms that are likely to adopt self-driving technology, most of them only actually move on the highways 7.5 to 8.5 hours a day. The rest of the time is inefficient time. And there are lots of reasons for that. Independent contracting is one of them.
We'll get
Delays
to
in
that later,
shipment.
but basically there is this possibility that you could squeeze more work out of a truck. You could increase the
Oh,
productivity.
absolutely. We could
Yeah,
definitely double the productivity of a typical truck,
of a single truck.
of a
So
single
that,
truck.
so
Yeah.
that would make shipping much cheaper. We have the possibility of reducing accidents. What are the other possible benefits?
Uh,
Environmental?
there are potential environmental benefits. Certainly, most of the scenarios for automation have at least 5 to 10% fuel economy savings. You could redesign the truck to be more aerodynamic. The automated driving would be more fuel efficient than a human driver who's not quite as good at figuring out how much to accelerate and when and how to brake. We could also have platooning where trucks can follow closer together when they're connected to one another and automated, which cuts down a lot on that aerodynamic drag. So all of that could potentially, reduce the fuel consumption of trucks. Now that's assuming that when we make all of this, much cheaper, take out the human labor component and this fuel savings, that we don't increase, right, the amount of truck transportation and sort of wipe out all of those environmental benefits, which I do think is a real threat.
Okay, yeah, that's one thing I've seen is that people are talking about doubling or tripling the number of trucks on the roads by 2050 or so.
Yeah.
So in order to do this, we kind of need to, in order to move forward with driverless and robot trucking, we need to kind of have a plan. So when the first automated truck drove or first autonomous truck drove in 2016, it was in Colorado, and it drove 50,000 cans of Budweiser, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, without a driver from one town to another town. And then immediately everybody said, oh, this is it. The truck drivers are over. And we're going to move. I think one of the, one of the headlines was self-driving trucks are going to hit us like a human-driven truck, which is like kind of weird. And everybody was saying that we were going to lose hundreds of thousands of jobs a year. So here we are, it's 2021 already, and we haven't lost all those jobs yet. Tell me what is wrong about the timeline. Like, how long is it actually going to take before we're in this world? And then we'll talk about the sort of deeper problems with the way we talk about the trucks.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it has to do with the way that our markets work, right? And one of them is the market for startups and raising capital in Silicon Valley, which was what was behind that 2016 demo of the Budweiser, which in reality it was driven out to a highway by a human driver to navigate the more complex driving environment, and then the highway had been essentially shut down. There were police escorts in front and behind. In fact, the Colorado Secretary of Transportation was in one of the following vehicles as this, self-driving truck piloted itself, 75 miles or whatever it did.
So it's kind of fantasy in a way, just that it's actually a self-driven truck, that the future is now and that it's delivering Budweiser.
Yeah, and it was, potentially a very profitable one. Of course, some of your listeners may be familiar with the Waymo Uber lawsuit, which came out of that demonstration. Essentially, that demonstration was made by Otto, which was then bought by Uber for $600 million, and there were allegations of theft of Google's technology in that transfer. So there is a strong incentive to both to raise capital, sell businesses, but also recruit talent among startups to be the first to do X, Y, or Z. So we've had the first driverless truck delivery. We've had the first delivery with no human, or the first trip with no human in the vehicle at all. The first coast to coast driving, right? So there's always this new sort of first,
right,
that people are sort of looking for. And in fact, the technology just hasn't been there. The problems of actually getting the truck to move from point A to point B, not just safely, but reliably, time after time, and cost effectively, they're much harder than folks anticipated. And so progress has been exaggerated and slower than anticipated.
So, and what's the problem with just always talking about it like, the technology makes the decisions? Like, no one's driving this but the technology, and we act like it's an automatic thing that it's going to take away jobs.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is, the sort of position that we've put ourselves in, right, is that we're going to look into our crystal balls and sort of figure out, what problems are going to come out of this inevitable kind of path, right, that the technology will put us on, and then we'll fix those problems. That's kind of the public policy role. And we really need to take a step back and look seriously at how new technologies develop, right? How they're adopted. And these things are contingent on a whole number of different, factors. It could be maybe the strength of labor, it could be policy, et cetera. But policy is really playing a key role. And that's obvious when we look at self-driving trucks. We would not be talking about self-driving trucks right now if it had not been for DARPA, right? And for the Defense Department's interest in self-driving trucks. This is, technology that sits on decades of investment in computer science and sensors and other sorts of technologies that are vital to this, that were made possible through public funding primarily of university research. And I understand completely, why the Defense Department wanted to do that. I've had the chance to interview drivers who were moving fuel to forward operating
Mm-hmm.
bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? With the threat of IEDs, these convoys, which
Right.
were costing
Very, very
$100
scary
a
work.
gallon,
Yeah.
to get diesel to a forward operating base. I understand what the public, value of having self-driving technology, but we're essentially looking at these threats to truckers' jobs that resulted from, our tax dollars being used to solve a military problem. And now that it's ready for potential commercialization, of course, the private sector has stepped in to try to bring these things to market and, of course, profit for themselves off of them.
So, what is so one of the things that people said when that first truck drove was that we were about to lose about 2 million trucking jobs. And one of the things that you've written about is that we don't know how many we'll lose. And one of the reasons is because actually it can be cheaper to have a human in that driver's seat.
Yeah.
So tell us about how, excuse me, tell us about how how are the decisions being made? It's not just like, okay, there's great technology, we can replace a person, we'll make more money that way. There's another, the whole world of how the decisions on driverless trucks get made is much larger. Give us some sense of what's going on.
Yeah, so there's some really practical on the ground sort of policy decisions and regulatory effects that we're going to see on the development of self-driving. So, right now, one of the limitations that self-driving trucks could help us overcome is the fact that human drivers are required to take breaks every so often, right? They're only allowed to drive a total of 11 hours per day. And after every 14 hours on duty, they need to take a 10-hour break, right? And so this, puts a hard stop to most truck drivers' days. And, they could potentially expand those days, right? I mean, those rules are all for safety reasons, right? Those regulations. If they could safely drive on the highway, which again is where those really dangerous, fatal accidents happen.
Right.
We could expand the amount of time that those trucks are driving. So the question then is, is that time going to count as off duty for those truck drivers? Right? Let's imagine that, the technology is good, but not so good that we can reliably put it out there without having, the driver there overseeing it in some fashion, right? Or responsible if it should encounter some environment that it can't handle. So the question becomes, will that driver be allowed to be off duty? Will that driver still be paid for that time? Right? Will that count as compensable time for things like minimum wage or even overtime, which truckers are currently exempted from, but lots of people think they should be entitled to.
In fact, it turns out over the past 4 years, they haven't even been able to take a 10-minute break every 4 hours.
Yeah, so the work hours that they have are just absolutely tremendous, and the pressure to drive once you have a load, that needs to get somewhere is tremendous. And part of the story of technology in the trucking industry is kind of taking away that autonomy of drivers, where you used to have a load going somewhere and it was either a very patterned run that the driver did regularly and was at home at night, or you'd say, okay, here's this load, it's going to some place, and the driver would decide how to get there, how to break up the driving, things like that. And they were relatively unmonitored. Today, with satellite linked computers, managers can, and two-way texting can see right where that truck is, what its speed, right, estimated time of arrival, and then coach the driver or manage them, direct them as they're performing the work.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of pressure that technology has put on drivers to produce, more and more miles in less and less time.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that, when we read about, a truck taking 50,000 cans of Budweiser that's undriven, you think like, oh, that's a total shift from today, where it's just drivers in trucks driving, by themselves. But in fact, it seems like over the past 30 or 40 years, actually the cockpit of the truck has really been transformed by technology. Like there's a lot of other sorts. There's GPS is governing them. They're contractors or the I don't know if it's the owners of the truck or the owners of the load can kind of control them. There's it's really a very different sort of setup.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, if anyone, is confused about why truckers are so concerned about this technology, right? From a driver's perspective, there has been tremendous technological change over the last few decades. And for them, the idea that self-driving trucks are going to result in some sort of upskilling of the job and suddenly it's going to become more attractive to young people and things like that does not ring true to truck drivers, because essentially we've seen 40 years of technology de-skilling the job and making it worse, right? So now the experienced valued truck driver who is just really good at operating that truck safely and conscientious and good at planning their work and knows the roads is in competition with a brand new worker who doesn't have to read a map. Right? I mean, you don't even have to read a map anymore. The trucks are now often automated rather than manual. So it shifts itself, which isn't
Right.
the sexiest form of automation, but it's a really important form
Yes.
of automation.
Right.
So all of these have driven down wages, right? Increased the monitoring and surveillance of drivers, and then the pressure from managers to push them, to produce more and more miles.
And so as this whole technology has come in, what's happened to drivers' pay?
Drivers, so, in the 1970s, the typical truck driver was earning in today's dollars over $100,000 a year. Now, some may say, okay, that's too much money for a truck driver. How could a truck driver earn that much? They have to be away from their family for weeks at a time. They work the equivalent of at least two full-time jobs, right? Today, the typical truck driver, especially at these big companies, will make somewhere between 35 and 45,000 in their first year, right? Probably something around 45,000 in their second year. So when you look at the fact that they're working 80, 90 hours a week sometimes, it's essentially a minimum wage job. When it used to pay better than being a unionized auto worker or steel worker, the Teamsters, which had organized the industry, they brought home, really good wages, benefits, and job security for truckers. That was before the industry was deregulated in 1980.
Okay. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. And also, I mean, truckers used to be considered like a very cool job. There were all these CB radio country songs. So basically, um, what you're saying is that all of these sort of the way that technology has rolled out into the trucking industry, where it's put most of the burden on the drivers, or it's basically taken money and time and decision making away from the drivers and kept it for the companies. That if I connect the dots, where do I end up with automated trucking? What's the end scenario if we keep going in the same path?
Yeah, well, right now we have, at least with the Trump administration, we've seen a DOT, that a federal DOT and many
Department of Transportation. Yeah.
yes, and many state departments of transportation that are, looking to smooth the path of self-driving trucks without restriction. Again, taking that kind of hands-off approach that says, well, there's got to be some one best way for this technology to develop. Let's just get out of the way of the people who are going to make this happen, and then we'll fix whatever problems are created there. So if we're going to take some other approach to that, right? I think we have to figure out where we want to end up, right? So
Mhm.
if we want to have high quality trucking jobs, if we want to have the most efficient, trucking industry that they can and the safest, I think
Mhm.
we've got to kind of set that endpoint, right? We've got to say, here are the goals. How would this technology help us meet them? Right? How do we incentivize these outcomes? And so, I think there are a number of different ways that could happen. One of which might be that
So,
autopilot, right? Where the
mhm.
autopilot scenario I describe in the piece in issues in which the driver's unpaid, the time that the truck's driving itself doesn't count for hours of service, on. And what that truck looks like is kind of a jack of all trades in terms of like its efficiency driving around the city, and then on the highway it's not very fuel efficient in either of them, right? And the driver's sort of resting in the back unpaid and de-skilled, right? Because now you don't have to worry about those high-speed accidents. That's one way that it could play out. Or we
Okay,
could
so let
have,
me just stop you right
yeah,
there. So what you're talking about is you're talking about a truck that starts at the depot. The driver gets in the seat, drives it out of the depot and up onto the highway, then goes to the back, lies down, isn't paid for that time that they're riding. The truck takes over, it drives to Nashville or whatever, gets to the exit, the driver gets back in and drives it off. And then this is just like it's really lonely. It's hours and hours alone on the road. Maybe you can play games in the back, but it's still not particularly fun or healthy. You're away from your family. The pay is presumably pretty terrible if they're not paying for the time that the driver's riding.
yeah.
But that's all sort of enabled by the current program of how we compensate drivers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, this is again, once you take those high speed accidents out of the equation, which is one of the big, benefits of having an experienced driver, you can even further de-skill those drivers. So, then are we as concerned whether the driver can pass drug tests or do other sorts of things or has, speeding violations or is a safe driver? No, so we're going to open up the pool to drivers who are less and less safe because the consequences of them being less safe, right, are the technologies, taking care of that. So it's a further de-skilling of the job.
Okay.
So that thing might roll, 20 hours a day, right?
Mhm.
So if you wanted to electrify this industry, right, which is a big priority of the Biden administration, right? The state of California is working on it as well.
Mhm.
If we want to electrify heavy duty trucks, which are by far the largest group of consumers of diesel, right,
Right.
per unit.
And they also have terrible emissions, so it would be huge.
Yeah. So if
So
you want to electrify those trucks, if that's part of the broader, vision of where we want to be, the idea that, these things are going to roll nonstop to all sorts of random locations like they do today, where's the charging infrastructure? Where's the time to charge these things, right? So that decision, right, to not count the work time or to not compensate that work time, right, actually may have a really big impact on whether or not we can electrify the industry.
okay.
So that's where we want to have that broader vision of the multiple goals we want to achieve in mind as we shape this policy.
So in other words, like don't get dazzled by the amazingness of getting all the diesel exhaust off the highways or changing the greenhouse gas profile of trucking or enabling yourself to, get 3 times as much stuff delivered. Um, without really thinking about what this does to jobs. And it is also the possibility that by paying more attention to these kind of regulatory decisions, we could really dramatically shape the kinds of jobs that come out of this. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. So, another scenario would be that we segment this drive these trips, right? So that we can focus on the technology that's most appropriate in each segment of it. So we might have a local truck that's
Hmm.
driven by a human being and is electric, right? That goes out to an interstate exit, swaps its trailer for a self-driving truck.
Hmm.
Now maybe that once we have the capability, maybe that truck drives itself without a driver in it, or maybe there's a truck with a human being in it, and then a drone unit, right, that's following that that human-driven truck. And then we can specialize that truck. Maybe it's still burning diesel for a while because of the cost and weight of electric batteries. But maybe it's geared for highway high-speed travel, and maybe it's super aerodynamic, right? We know that with off-the-shelf technology, we could double fuel efficiency in that segment of driving, that driving environment right now. But since the truck needs to operate in both currently, right, that stuff doesn't get adopted. So we could deliberately segment these things. I call them autonomous truck ports. They would be these spots outside of cities where we would, maybe we'd use it for congestion pricing or diesel-free zones, right, to prevent diesel emissions from, harming communities of color, which suffer most from, this air pollution currently, right? And so we'd have a place for electric charging stations, right, that infrastructure for electric charging. And we'd be able to incentivize the investment in the best technology for each segment on either side of that. And we could also do off-peak delivery and keep those trucks out of the rush hour, et cetera. So that's the kind of vision, not saying that's the only one that would work or that necessarily even the best one, but that's the kind of global vision that I think we should be thinking about as we shape these policies.
So it's interesting because we always, as with Facebook, we let things happen and then we kind of regulate afterwards. And in this case, you have to get very deliberately into the regulation beforehand. So how's that going?
Well, I think, this is a potential wake up call for truck drivers. And I try to talk to drivers. I'm working on a project on last mile delivery right now as well. But I try to talk to drivers, at least once a week. I'm talking to a driver. Sometimes I'm doing, 2 or 3 interviews a week. And there's been a real sobering up with the Trump administration's approach among drivers who at first got really excited, because the president had a truck at the White House. I think they might have done that twice, right?
Yeah.
And claimed to be a friend of the truck driver, and there've been a number of regulations now toward the end of the administration that have made it very clear that that the industry has largely been pulling, the levers on what they want, and has been completely in control of policy in recent years. This includes opening up driving to drivers who are less than 21 years old, like so teenagers driving these big trucks, which is just crazy, and other sorts of rules that haven't been particularly good for truckers. But on the automation front, it's essentially been one of complete avoidance of the issue. So Susan Collins and Jack Reed, I believe it was back in 2016 or early 2017, called, in the Senate, had hearings, called for research on the labor impacts of self-driving trucks. That research process started. A number of agencies were involved in it. So National Science Foundation, GAO, the Government Accountability Office, Department of Labor, Department of Transportation. They produced a report in the summer of 2019 that went to the Office of Management and Budget, the White House, and promptly died there. And so, this research on the potential impacts of self-driving technology has been there for, a year and a half now, has not been released. Meanwhile, we're making grants to look at the, how to speed up the adoption of self-driving, how to integrate it into existing fleets, how to meet the safety, how to achieve the safety benefits of it, all while we really don't want to even discuss or acknowledge the potential labor impacts. And as a sociologist who studied the industry, this is how you do policy like this, right? To the interests of, only the special interests, right? It's about the questions that you ask. So if our government policy continually asks the question, what are the safety benefits and how do we achieve them? And that's the only question that it asks, we're going to ignore all the rest of these issues. And that's what you want when you get to Congress. So you have, here's $2 billion in safety benefits, and then here's a whole bunch of other stuff that we really don't know the value of, and it's sort of a he said, she said sort of debate about whether or not it's going to hurt workers, help workers, or what any of that means. So leave it unaddressed, essentially.
So some of the things that we can do are, one is talk about, get our elected representatives at the federal level to talk about this issue. Another thing is for truckers themselves to talk about the issue and mobilize. Is there anything that like towns can do or communities should be doing to think this through? I mean, it seems like you've described the job as essentially sweatshops on wheels. If we sort of go in that direction, and that's a pretty sad ending for a technology that has so much promise to actually create good jobs and other good stuff. But we're not going to get that unless we push for it. So is there room at the local level for pushing, or where are most of the levers?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the local and the state level is absolutely critical, and I think we're going to need robust federal policy, but that policy needs to be informed by state level processes that evaluate for localities and for the state. What are the interests to the businesses in our area, right, or in our state, the workers in our state? What about all of the states that are the equivalent of drive-through, flyover states, but they're drive-through states, right? Some of which derive significant benefits from the trucking industry because they sell fuel or have diners and service areas. Some of them not so much. If you look at a place like Chicago, right, which is a major freight hub, there's lots of freight that generates business for Chicago and Illinois and surrounding areas, but there's lots of freight that simply just moves through and clogs up its congestion, its roadways and its air quality, right? And so you're going to have different impacts. Now, if we were to see, a doubling of this long haul truck traffic, right, but it's not stopping, right, it's going to really shift the costs and benefits of the trucking industry, but it's going to be even more transformative of supply chains more broadly. So if you look at a Walmart store right now, or Walmart distribution network, the way that it works is essentially every store is within a day's drive out and back for a human driven truck. And in the center of that network is a distribution
center. Explains why the stores are where they are. Yes.
Yeah. And so now, the same thing with like a chicken production, facility and things like that, right? They're all based on the limitations of a human-driven truck. Well, now if a truck that's going to bring that chicken or that Walmart load out to a store can go twice as far, or even further, right? You're going to change where those warehousing, areas are, where the distribution nodes are. So, you're going to really transform the supply chain. And so these are things that we're going to need to think about, and I think to have effective sort of stakeholder engagement, right, for communities, for state departments of transportation, for workers and others, we're going to have a broad, comprehensive conversation about what do we want freight movement to look like, as opposed to some other areas of technology affecting work. We have more levers here because the workplace of truckers is the public roadway, and so we have lots of skin in the game. And we also have lots of levers that we have the authority to pull about, when we want trucks to move, where we want them to move, how many, what we want them to pay for, et cetera, in a way that sometimes automation in a private factory or something like that, we don't have those levers.
Right. And even with the taxi or the sort of the Uber situation, we don't have quite as many levers as we have with robot trucking. That's a really interesting sort of place to end on, is that in a weird way, it's actually kind of hopeful. Even if you look at this last 40 years of regulatory history and the history of the technology in the cab, you actually have, there's quite a lot policy-wise that could be done, and the technology is not deterministic. I have one last question for you, which is, why do we always insist that the technology makes the decisions and it's not us?
I don't know. Maybe we have just so much faith in it because we're so dependent on technology everywhere in our lives, and it's kind of magic. So we take it for granted that there must be, some logic behind it that makes more sense of it than we can make of it.
Well, yeah, or maybe that's the story we tell ourselves. I'm not sure, but anyway, I hope that we can end this by questioning more of the technology and not accepting things as inevitable. So thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate your conversation. This has been wonderful. I'm going to give you just some, we have to close here. And thank you again. And to everyone watching, thank you for joining us. Please visit Zócalo's website, zocalopublicsquare.org, to read a summary of this conversation, as well as many other essays and articles, and to hear and learn about other conversations like this one. You can also visit Issues in Science and Technology. Our website is issues.org. For insightful writing and conversations on science and science policy, including Steve's recent article, which is a really wonderful portrait of how robot trucking doesn't have to be the way it seems to be going. Thank you again, and have a lovely afternoon. Take care.